There's a moment that happens sometimes when you're driving at night on an empty highway. You see headlights in the distance, far ahead. They're moving toward you. You can tell they're moving, but only barely. The change is so gradual that if you blink, you might miss it entirely. The lights grow brighter pixel by pixel over the course of 30 seconds, a minute, sometimes longer. And then suddenly, the car is passing you. The transition from distant to immediate happens in an instant that seems to contradict everything that came before it. The slow approach and the sudden presence feel like two different events, even though they're part of the same continuous motion. Urgency works like that. It's not an absolute property of a situation. It's a function of where you're standing when you measure it. This isn't a metaphor. It's geometry. Consider a fire alarm in a building. When it goes off, everyone inside experiences it as an immediate, sharp event. The sound is loud. The instruction is clear. The stakes are binary. Move or don't move. There's no ambiguity in the signal. Urgency, in that moment, is total. But step outside the building. Walk a block away. The alarm is still happening, but now it's one sound among many. It's competing with traffic, with wind, with the ambient hum of a city. It's no longer a command, it's information. Walk 10 blocks away. You can't hear it at all. The event is still occurring, but from where you're standing, it might as well not be. The urgency hasn't changed for the people inside the building, but for you it's been erased by distance. This is not a failure of perception. It's not a flaw in how you're paying attention. It's a consequence of scale. Let's stay with that fire alarm for a moment, because it helps clarify something that's easy to overlook. The alarm itself is a technology designed to collapse distance. It's engineered to be loud enough that everyone within a certain radius experiences the same level of urgency at the same time. That's its function. It creates a temporary, local unanimity about what matters right now. But the unanimity is artificial. It's maintained by proximity. The farther you move from the source, the more that unanimity dissolves, until eventually you cross a threshold where the alarm becomes irrelevant to your immediate experience. What's interesting is that this threshold isn't arbitrary. It's predictable. Sound intensity decreases with the square of the distance from the source. Double the distance, and the sound is 4 times quieter. Triple the distance, 9 times quieter. The math is indifferent to the content of the sound. A fire alarm and a car horn follow the same curve. Urgency, at least in this physical sense, obeys an inverse square law. Now think about time instead of space. Imagine you receive a message that says you need to complete a task by the end of the day. The deadline is 8 hours away. That might feel urgent, depending on the task. The window is small. The pressure is real. Now imagine the same task, but the deadline is 8 months away. The task hasn't changed. The requirement hasn't changed. But the urgency has evaporated. 8 months feels like endless time, even though it isn't. It's 240 times longer than 8 hours, but it doesn't feel 240 times less urgent. It feels fundamentally different. It feels like a different category of problem. And if the deadline is 8 years away, the task becomes theoretical. It's something you'll deal with eventually, maybe if it still matters by then. The urgency has been diluted beyond recognition. This is the same pattern as the fire alarm. Distance in time does what distance in space does. It softens the edges of urgency until the signal is no longer distinguishable from the background. Let's zoom out further. The sun will eventually expand into a red giant and consume the Earth. This is not speculation. It's a well-understood consequence of stellar evolution. Our sun is currently about 4.6 billion years old. In roughly 5 billion years, it will exhaust the hydrogen in its core and begin fusing helium. As it does, it will expand. The inner planets, Mercury, Venus, possibly Earth, will be engulfed. This is an emergency in the most literal sense. The destruction is total. There is no ambiguity about the outcome. And yet, it doesn't feel urgent. Why not? The answer is scale. 5 billion years is a duration so far beyond human experience that it doesn't register as time in any meaningful sense. It's a number. We can say it, we can write it down, but we can't feel it. Our nervous systems weren't built to process intervals that long. For comparison, 5 billion years ago, Earth didn't have oxygen in its atmosphere. There were no plants, no animals, no fungi. There were only single-celled organisms, most of them anaerobic. The entire history of complex life on Earth, everything from the first fish to the first human, has happened in less time than we have left before the sun expands. So, when we're told the Earth will be destroyed in 5 billion years, we're not receiving an urgent message. We're receiving information about a distant boundary condition. The event is real, but the urgency has been stretched so thin by time that it's become transparent. Here's where it gets strange. If you compress that same event into a smaller time frame, the urgency reappears instantly. Imagine an asteroid is going to impact Earth in 5 billion years. No one cares. Now imagine the same asteroid will impact Earth in 50 years. Suddenly, it's a crisis. Governments convene. Resources are mobilized. The event hasn't changed. The outcome is identical. But the distance in time has collapsed. And with it, the urgency has condensed back into something sharp and immediate. This tells us something uncomfortable. Urgency is not a measure of consequence. It's a measure of proximity. The destruction of Earth is the same event, regardless of when it happens. But we only experience it as urgent when it falls within a horizon we can perceive. Let's shift to a different kind of distance. Imagine you're standing in a field, and in the distance, you see two people arguing. You can't hear what they're saying. You can see their gestures, the movement of their bodies, but the content of the argument is inaccessible to you. From where you're standing, the argument doesn't feel urgent. It's something happening over there. To them. You're an observer, not a participant. Now imagine you walk closer. At some point, you start to hear fragments of their voices. You still can't make out the words, but you can hear the tone. The urgency in their voices starts to reach you. You're not yet part of the argument, but you're beginning to feel its gravity. Walk closer still, and you can hear the words. Now you understand what they're fighting about. Maybe it's trivial, maybe it's serious, but now the urgency is fully present for you, even though you're still not directly involved. Finally, Imagine one of them turns to you and pulls you into the argument. Now the urgency is total. You're no longer observing. You're inside it. The argument was the same event the entire time, but your experience of its urgency was entirely a function of your distance from it. This same pattern repeats at every scale. Think about a news report describing a famine in a country you've never visited. The report tells you that thousands of people are starving. The situation is urgent for them. It's a crisis. But for you, sitting in a room on the other side of the world, it's information. You might feel something, sympathy, sadness, concern, but you don't feel urgency in the way the people experiencing the famine do. Now imagine the famine is in your city. Suddenly, the urgency is much closer. It's no longer abstract. You start to think about what it means for you, for people you know. Now imagine the famine is in your household. The urgency is total. The famine itself hasn't changed. The number of people suffering is the same, but the urgency you feel scales with proximity in a way that has nothing to do with the magnitude of the event. This creates a problem. If urgency is a function of proximity, then our sense of what matters is going to be biased toward whatever is nearby. Not nearby in terms of importance, but nearby in terms of space, time, or social distance. We can know, intellectually, that something far away is important. We can understand that a problem 5 years from now is worth addressing. We can recognize that suffering on the other side of the world is real. But knowing and feeling are not the same thing. Urgency is a feeling, and feelings don't scale linearly. Let's try a thought experiment. Imagine you're told that in exactly 100 years, a catastrophic event will occur. It will displace millions of people, reshape ecosystems, and alter the course of human civilization. You're also told that if we act now, we can prevent it. The actions required are modest, small changes in behavior, incremental policy shifts, nothing dramatic. How urgent does that feel? For most people, the answer is not very. 100 years is far enough away that it feels like someone else's problem. It's not that we don't care. It's that the deadline is beyond our horizon. We have more immediate concerns. Things that need to be dealt with today, this week, this year. Now imagine the same catastrophe, but the timeline is compressed to 10 years. Suddenly, it feels more urgent. 10 years is still far away, but it's within the range of planning. People alive today will still be alive then. Children being born now will be affected. Compress it further to 1 year. Now it's a crisis. Resources are mobilized, plans are made, the event is imminent, same catastrophe, same scale of impact, but the urgency is entirely dependent on the timeline. This isn't a flaw in human psychology, it's a feature. Our brains evolved to respond to immediate threats. A predator in the bushes, a rival tribe approaching, a fire spreading through dry grass. These are problems that need to be solved right now, not later. For most of human history, the future beyond a few seasons was largely unpredictable and mostly irrelevant to survival. Planning for events decades or centuries away would have been a waste of cognitive resources. So we develop nervous systems that are exquisitely sensitive to immediate danger and remarkably indifferent to distant threats. This worked well for a long time. It stops working when the scale of the problems changes. Here's an example. Carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for a very long time. When we burn fossil fuels, we're not just creating a problem for right now. We're creating a problem that will persist for centuries. A molecule of CO2 emitted today will still be affecting the climate in the year 2300. Some of it will remain for thousands of years. But we don't feel urgency about the year 2300. We can't. The year 2300 is as distant to us as the year 1700. We can think about it abstractly, but we can't feel it. So we're in a situation where the consequences of our actions extend far beyond our horizon of urgency. This creates a mismatch. The problem is urgent in an objective sense. The window for action is closing, but it doesn't feel urgent because the worst consequences are still far enough away that they don't trigger our alarm systems. Let's slow down for a moment and clarify what we mean by scale. Scale, in this context, is the ratio between the size of something and the size of our ability to perceive it. If something is at human scale, a room, a day, a conversation, we can grasp it directly. We don't need tools or abstractions. We just experience it. But if something is much larger or much smaller than human scale, we lose that direct access. We can't directly perceive the motion of continents. We can't feel the passage of 1,000,000 years. We can't see bacteria without a microscope or galaxies without a telescope. These things exist, but they're outside the range of our senses. And when something is outside the range of our senses, it tends to be outside the range of our urgency. Think about bacteria. For most of human history, we had no idea bacteria existed. We couldn't see them. We couldn't measure them. We experienced their effects, disease, infection, spoilage, but we didn't know the cause. From our perspective, illness was mysterious. It happened for reasons we couldn't see. We invented explanations. Bad air, imbalanced humors, divine punishment, because we needed some way to make sense of it. Then, in the 1670s, Antony van Leeuwenhoek built a microscope and looked at a drop of water. He saw tiny organisms moving around. He called them animalcules. This discovery didn't change the bacteria. They were doing the same thing they'd always been doing. But it changed our relationship to them. Suddenly, illness wasn't mysterious. It had a cause we could observe, and once we could observe it, we could start to do something about it. The urgency didn't change. People were getting sick at the same rate, but our ability to perceive the cause brought it within the range of action. Scale determines not just what we notice, but what we can respond to. Let's apply this to time. Human lifespans are roughly 70 to 80 years. This is the window within which we experience time directly. We remember our childhood. We anticipate our old age. We plan for the decades ahead. But we don't experience centuries. We can read about them, we can study history, but we don't feel them the way we feel years. And we certainly don't experience geological time. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. This is a number we can write down, but it's not a duration we can feel. To put it in perspective, if the entire history of Earth were compressed into a single 24-hour day, humans would appear in the last few seconds before midnight. Recorded history would be a fraction of the final second. This means that nearly everything we think of as important, civilizations, empires, wars, discoveries, happens in a sliver of time so small It's almost invisible at geological scale. This doesn't mean those things aren't important, but it does mean that their urgency is local. It's confined to the scale at which we live. Here's where things get uncomfortable. If urgency is a function of scale, and if most of the things we consider urgent are only urgent at human scale, then what happens when we zoom out? Let's try it. Zoom out from your immediate surroundings. You're sitting in a room, maybe, or walking down a street. From this scale, your concerns are vivid. You have things to do today, deadlines to meet, problems to solve. Zoom out to the scale of a city. Your individual concerns start to blur into the aggregate. You're one person among millions. Your urgency is still there, but it's not unique. Everyone around you has their own urgencies, their own deadlines, their own problems. Zoom out to the scale of a country. The specifics dissolve further. You're part of a population. Your individual urgency is statistically insignificant. Zoom out to the scale of the planet. You're one of 8 billion people. Your concerns, your deadlines, your emergencies, they're invisible from this distance. Zoom out to the scale of the solar system. Earth is a small blue dot. The urgencies happening on its surface don't register at all. Zoom out to the scale of the galaxy. The solar system is a speck. The sun is one of hundreds of billions of stars. Zoom out to the scale of the observable universe. The galaxy is one of trillions. At this scale, urgency doesn't just fade. It becomes meaningless. This is not nihilism. It's geometry. Urgency is real at the scale where it occurs. The fire alarm is genuinely urgent for the people in the building. The deadline is genuinely urgent for the person trying to meet it. But urgency doesn't propagate across scales. It's a local phenomenon. This creates a strange situation. We live our lives at human scale where urgency feels absolute. But we also live on a planet that operates at geological scale, in a solar system that operates at astronomical scale, in a universe that operates at cosmological scale. At these larger scales, the things that feel urgent to us don't register. This isn't because the universe is indifferent. It's because urgency is a property of perception, and perception is scale dependent. Let's come back to something more tangible. Imagine you're watching a time-lapse video of a flower blooming. The video compresses hours into seconds. You see the petals unfold, the stem elongate, the flower open. At normal speed, this process is slow. You'd have to sit and watch for hours to see the change. It would feel gradual, almost imperceptible. But in the time-lapse, it feels urgent. The flower is moving fast. Things are happening. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine a video that stretches a single second into an hour. A drop of water falling from a faucet. A hand reaching for a doorknob. At normal speed, these actions feel immediate. But stretched out, they become glacial. The urgency dissolves. The events haven't changed. The flower is blooming at the same rate. The drop is falling at the same speed. But by changing the scale of observation, we change the character of the experience. Urgency is frame rate dependent. This has implications. If urgency is a function of the scale at which we observe something, then we can manipulate our sense of urgency by changing the scale. Zoom in, and small things become urgent. A typo in an email, a delayed train, a misplaced set of keys. Zoom out, and those same things dissolve. They're not important. They're noise. But here's the problem. We can't always choose the scale. We live at a particular scale, whether we like it or not. We experience time at the rate of 1 second per second. We experience space at the scale of our bodies. We can think about other scales. We can imagine them, but we can't live at them. This means we're stuck with the urgencies that arise at human scale, even when we know, intellectually, that they're not urgent at larger or smaller scales. Let's think about the opposite problem. Sometimes, things that are not urgent at human scale become urgent at other scales. Consider erosion. If you look at a mountain, it appears solid, permanent, unchanging. You could visit the same mountain every day for your entire life, and it would look essentially the same. But the mountain is eroding. Wind and water are slowly wearing it down. Over millions of years, the mountain will be reduced to rubble and eventually to dust. This process is not urgent at human scale. It's invisible. But at geological scale, it's constant, relentless, inevitable. The same is true for tectonic drift. The continents are moving. Right now, as you read this, North America is drifting away from Europe at about the same rate your fingernails grow, roughly 2.5 centimeters per year. This is not urgent. You will never notice it. But over tens of millions of years, it will rearrange the surface of the planet. These processes are urgent at their own scale. They're just not urgent at ours. Here's another example. The universe is expanding. Every galaxy that isn't gravitationally bound to our own is moving away from us. The farther away a galaxy is, the faster it's receding. This is happening right now. It's been happening for 13.8 billion years, and it will continue happening for trillions of years more. Is this urgent? At cosmological scale, yes. The expansion of the universe determines the fate of everything in it. It determines whether galaxies will eventually merge or drift apart. It determines whether stars will keep forming or whether the universe will go dark. But at human scale, it's irrelevant. The expansion is so slow, and the distances involved are so vast, that it has no impact on our daily experience. We can measure it, we can study it, but we can't feel it, so it doesn't feel urgent. Let's try to summarize where we are. Urgency is not an inherent property of events. It's a property of the relationship between the event and the observer. The same event can be urgent or non-urgent depending on how far away it is in space, how far away it is in time, how large it is relative to the observer, how fast it's happening relative to the observer's perception. Urgency, in other words, is contextual. This creates a problem because we tend to treat urgency as if it's absolute. We say things like, "This is urgent," as if urgency is a quality of the thing itself, but it's not. Urgency is a quality of our relationship to the thing. Let's explore this a bit further. Think about a clock. When you glance at a clock, you see the position of the hands. If you're in a hurry and the clock shows that you're running late, you feel urgency. But the clock doesn't know you're in a hurry. The clock is just measuring time. It's indifferent to your deadline. The urgency is something you're bringing to the interaction. Now imagine you look at the same clock, but you're not in a hurry. You have nowhere to be. The clock shows the same time, but now there's no urgency. The clock hasn't changed. The time hasn't changed. But the urgency has appeared or disappeared based on your context. This seems obvious, but it's worth stating explicitly. Urgency is not in the world. It's in us. Here's a harder question. If urgency is subjective, if it's a function of our perception rather than an objective property of events, does that mean it's arbitrary? Can we just decide that something is or isn't urgent? The answer is sort of, but not really. We can, to some extent, choose how we frame things. We can remind ourselves that a missed deadline is not the end of the world. We can put things in perspective, but we can't fully control our sense of urgency, because urgency is partly automatic. It's built into our nervous systems. When a loud noise happens suddenly, you startle. You don't choose to startle. Your body responds before your conscious mind has time to evaluate the situation. Urgency works the same way. When something feels urgent, it's not because you've decided it's urgent. It's because your nervous system has flagged it as something that requires immediate attention. You can override this sometimes. You can talk yourself down, but you can't eliminate the signal entirely. So, we're in a strange position. We know that urgency is scale-dependent and observer-dependent. We know it's not an absolute property of events, but we still feel it as if it's absolute. This creates a kind of tension. On one hand, we want to take urgent things seriously. If something feels urgent, there's usually a reason. Our nervous systems are trying to tell us something. On the other hand, we know that most of the things that feel urgent are only urgent within a narrow frame. Zoom out, and then noise. So how do we navigate this? Let's think about what urgency actually does. At its core, urgency is a signal that compresses decision-making time. When something is urgent, you don't have the luxury of deliberation. You have to act quickly with incomplete information. This is useful in some situations. If a car is about to hit you, you don't want to spend time weighing your options. You want to move immediately. But urgency is a blunt instrument. It doesn't distinguish between life-threatening situations and trivial ones. It just says, this needs attention now. And because it compresses decision-making time, it tends to produce worse decisions. When you're in a state of urgency, you're not thinking clearly. You're reacting. This is fine when the situation genuinely requires an immediate reaction. But most situations don't. Most of the time, urgency is a false alarm. Here's an example. You receive an email marked urgent. Your heart rate increases slightly. You open it immediately, even though you were in the middle of something else. The email turns out to be a routine request that could have waited until tomorrow. But the label urgent triggered a response. You reacted as if it were important, even though it wasn't. This happens constantly. We're surrounded by signals that claim to be urgent. Notifications, deadlines, alerts. Most of them aren't, but we respond to them anyway because urgency is hard to ignore. This creates a kind of background noise. If everything is marked urgent, then nothing is. But we can't filter out the noise entirely, because some of the signals actually are urgent. So we end up in a state of constant low-level alertness, responding to signals that mostly don't matter, while trying to remain sensitive to the few that do. This is exhausting. Let's zoom out again. At larger scales, urgency starts to look different. Think about climate change. At the scale of a human lifetime, climate change is slow. The temperature has increased by about 1 degree Celsius over the past century. That's a small change. You wouldn't notice it from one year to the next. But at the scale of the Earth's climate system, 1 degree is significant. It's enough to shift weather patterns, melt ice sheets, raise sea levels. So, is climate change urgent? At human scale, it doesn't feel urgent. The changes are gradual. We have time. But at planetary scale, the window for action is closing rapidly. The problem is that we live at human scale, not planetary scale. We experience time as days and years, not centuries and millennia. So even though we know intellectually that climate change is urgent, it doesn't feel urgent in the way a fire alarm does. This is not a new problem. Humans have always struggled to respond to slow-moving threats. The difference is that for most of history, slow-moving threats were rare. If a volcano was going to erupt, it usually gave warning signs: earthquakes, steam, ash. The threat was slow enough to perceive, but fast enough to trigger urgency. If a drought was developing, you could see the water levels dropping, the crops failing. The threat was gradual, but the feedback was direct. But now, we're dealing with threats that operate at scales far beyond our perceptual range. We're altering the composition of the atmosphere in ways that won't fully manifest for decades or centuries. We're depleting resources at rates that won't become critical until long after we're gone. We're creating problems that are urgent at scales we can't feel. Let's think about this from the other direction. What happens when we zoom in instead of out? At very small scales, urgency starts to break down in a different way. Consider the lifespan of a mayfly. Mayflies live for a single day. They hatch in the morning, mate in the afternoon, and die by evening. From a mayfly's perspective, a day is a lifetime. Everything that happens within that day is happening at maximum urgency. But from our perspective, a mayfly's entire life is a brief flicker. Now imagine a creature that lives for 1,000 years. From its perspective, a human lifetime would be a brief flicker. What feels urgent to us, a career, a relationship, a crisis, would be a momentary event to such a creature. This doesn't mean our urgencies are invalid. They're real for us. But it does mean that urgency is relative to the lifespan of the observer. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you could adjust your perception of time. You could speed it up or slow it down at will. If you slowed your perception, a day would feel like a year. Conversations would become tedious. A meal would take forever. If you sped it up, a year would feel like a day. Seasons would flicker past. Buildings would rise and fall in moments. At what speed would urgency feel most accurate? The answer is, there is no correct speed. Urgency is a function of the speed at which you're experiencing time. And there's no objective standard for that. A mayfly's urgencies are real for a mayfly. Our urgencies are real for us. 1,000-year-old tree's urgencies would be real for it if it could feel urgency. None of these perspectives is more valid than the others. They're just different frames. Let's come back to the original question. How does scale turn urgency into noise? The answer is by dilution. When you zoom out in space, urgency dilutes because signals get weaker with distance. When you zoom out in time, urgency dilutes because deadlines get farther away. When you zoom out in scale, urgency dilutes because individual events become less distinct. The urgency doesn't disappear. It's still there, at the scale where it originated. But from far enough away, it becomes indistinguishable from everything else. It becomes part of the background. Think about a city at night, viewed from an airplane. From the ground, the city is full of urgencies. Traffic lights changing, people rushing to catch trains, emergency vehicles responding to calls. But from the airplane, all of that detail is gone. You see a grid of lights. The lights are steady. They don't convey urgency. They don't tell you anything about what's happening on the ground. The urgencies are still there, but they have been averaged out. They've become texture. This is what scale does. It doesn't eliminate urgency. It smooths it. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine you're listening to a recording of a conversation. At normal speed, you can hear the pauses, the hesitations, the changes in tone. The conversation has rhythm and urgency. Now speed up the recording. Play it at double speed, then 4 times speed, then 10 times. At some point, the words become unintelligible. The pauses disappear. The urgency is gone. All you hear is a high-pitched buzz. The conversation is still there, encoded in the signal, but urgency has been lost in the compression. This is what happens when you zoom out in time. Events that felt urgent at human scale become a blur at larger scales. Not because they weren't urgent, but because urgency doesn't survive the transformation. Let's slow down and think about silence for a moment. Silence is not the absence of sound. It's the absence of sound that you're paying attention to. There are always sounds. Air moving, electronics humming, your own breathing. But when you say it's silent, you mean those sounds have faded into the background. They're not demanding your attention. Urgency works the same way. There are always urgent things happening somewhere. But when we say something is no longer urgent, we mean it's faded into the background. It's not that the urgency has disappeared. It's that we've stopped paying attention to it. And we stop paying attention when it's far enough away, in space, in time, or in scale, that it no longer competes for our immediate awareness. Here's a concrete example. Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is experiencing a medical emergency. That emergency is urgent for them. It's the most important thing happening in their life at this moment. But for you reading this, it's not urgent. You don't know who they are. You don't know where they are. You can't do anything about it. The urgency is real, but it's not yours. Now imagine you learn that the person having the emergency is someone you know. Suddenly, it's urgent for you too. Not as urgent as it is for them, but urgent enough that you drop what you're doing to help. The emergency hasn't changed, but the distance between you and it has collapsed. And with that collapse, urgency reappears. This pattern repeats at every level. A war happening on the other side of the world is less urgent than a crime happening in your neighborhood. A problem that will emerge in 50 years is less urgent than a problem happening next week. A threat to a species you've never heard of is less urgent than a threat to your pet. None of this is rational. Objectively, The suffering of a stranger is as real as the suffering of a friend. The destruction of a distant ecosystem is as consequential as the destruction of a nearby one. But urgency doesn't care about objective importance. It cares about proximity. Let's think about what this means for how we organize our lives. We live in a world of overlapping urgencies. Some are personal, deadlines, appointments, responsibilities. Some are social, crises, conflicts, emergencies affecting people we care about. Some are global, environmental changes, political shifts, technological disruptions. All of these urgencies are real, but they're not all equally immediate. And because urgency is a function of proximity, we tend to prioritize the things that are closest even when the things that are farther away are objectively more important. This creates a kind of structural bias. We're good at responding to immediate threats. We're bad at responding to distant ones. Here's an uncomfortable fact. Most of the problems that will shape the future are not urgent right now. They're slow-moving, they're distant, they don't trigger our alarm systems. But by the time they become urgent, by the time they're close enough to feel immediate, it will often be too late to do much about them. This is the paradox of urgency at scale. The things that matter most are often the things that feel least urgent. And the things that feel most urgent are often noise. Let's think about noise for a moment. Noise, in this context, is not random. It's signal that's been degraded by distance or scale. When you're standing next to a speaker, you hear music, clear, distinct, structured. Walk far enough away, and the music becomes noise. You can tell something is playing, but you can't make out the melody. The music hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. Urgency works the same way. Up close, urgency is clear. It's a specific demand. Do this now. Far away, urgency is noise. It's a general sense that something is happening, somewhere, but the specifics are lost. This raises a question. If urgency degrades with distance, how do we decide what to pay attention to? We can't respond to everything. We don't have the time, the energy, or the resources. So we have to filter. But the filters we use are based on proximity, not importance. We pay attention to what's nearby, what's immediate, what's loud, and we ignore what's distant, what's slow, what's quiet. This is efficient in the short term, but it's dangerous in the long term. Let's think about an analogy. Imagine you're in a boat on a lake. The lake is calm. The water is smooth. You're drifting. In the distance, you can see storm clouds forming. They're far away. They're not moving quickly. Do you start rowing toward shore? The storm is not urgent. It's miles away. You have time. But the storm is real, and it's getting closer. If you wait until the storm feels urgent, until the wind picks up, until the rain starts, it might be too late to reach shore safely. This is the problem with urgency. It tells you when to act based on proximity, not based on consequence. By the time something feels urgent, the window for effective action may have already closed. Here's another example. Think about health. When you're young, your health doesn't feel urgent. You can skip sleep, eat poorly, avoid exercise, and your body compensates. The consequences are distant. They're accumulating, but slowly, too slowly to feel. Then decades later, the consequences arrive. Heart disease, diabetes, joint problems. Now it's urgent, but now it's also harder to fix. If you'd acted earlier, when it didn't feel urgent, the problem would have been easier to prevent. But you didn't act because the signal was too weak. It was noise. This is the core tension. Urgency is a signal that tells us to act now. But the things that most need action are often the things that don't feel urgent yet. So we're stuck. We can't ignore urgency because sometimes it's real. But we can't rely on urgency because it's biased toward the near and the loud. Let's zoom out one more time. At the largest scales, cosmological scales, urgency disappears entirely. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. It will continue existing for trillions of years more. At this scale, nothing that happens in a human lifetime is urgent. Civilizations rise and fall. Species emerge and go extinct. Planets form and are destroyed. All of it happens. But none of it is urgent at cosmological scale. The universe doesn't have deadlines. It doesn't hurry. It just continues. This doesn't mean that urgency is meaningless. It means that urgency is local. For the people in the burning building, the fire alarm is urgent. For the person with the deadline is urgent. For the planet experiencing climate change, the changes are urgent. But none of these urgencies propagate beyond their own scale. They're real where they occur. But they don't echo outward forever. They fade. Here's what we're left with. Urgency is a feeling that arises when something demands immediate attention. But what counts as immediate depends on the scale at which you're operating. At small scales, urgency is sharp and frequent. At large scales, urgency is rare and diffuse. And at the largest scales, urgency doesn't exist at all. This is not a judgment. It's an observation. Urgency is a tool for navigating time and space at human scale. It helps us prioritize. It helps us act. But it's not a measure of importance. It's a measure of proximity. Let's end with a simple image. Imagine you're standing on a hill at night, looking at the lights of a distant city. The city is full of activity. People are working, arguing, celebrating, grieving. Each of those people is experiencing their own urgencies, deadlines, crises, emergencies. But from where you're standing, you can't see any of that. You just see lights, steady, quiet, evenly distributed. The urgencies are still there, but the distance has turned them into texture. From far enough away, even the sharpest alarms become part of the background, not because they don't matter, but because scale is indifferent to volume. Urgency is loud only when the horizon is small. At larger scales, it dissolves, not into nothing, into everything.